So yeah, for the record, I'm Cliff Marr, Director of the Polk County Board of Elections, and we're here to talk a little bit about voting tonight, and specifically maybe in Tryon. So a little bit, I guess, about myself. Sherelle had asked me to write a bio, but things got busy and I never got to it. My name is Cliff Marr. I was actually born in North Carolina at Fort Bragg, and was here for all of 6 days before I started my military brat hops around the world. So never grew up in the school for more than 2 years at a time, and we lived all up and down the eastern seaboard, in Germany, Venezuela, and Mexico as well.
Oh, wow.
And so eventually I found myself in Virginia, married my wife there, and we moved back to her hometown, which was Hendersonville, North Carolina, where we started raising our children. So we've been there now for 24 years. And so this is home more than 8 times any other place has ever been. Love Western North Carolina, and I'm very glad we settled here. I worked in the Henderson County Board of Elections for about 12 years before coming to Polk County, and as an election specialist. So that we basically deal with the voting systems and anything that can go wrong on election day was basically my responsibility. And then just in January of 2016, the Polk County Board of Elections hired me as the director here just before the presidential primaries. So I've been through quite a few intense elections down here, and looking forward to serving the community even more. So Board of Elections, in case you don't know, there's a 4-person Board of Elections in Polk County, 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, and they're nominated by your local parties. So the local parties have some nominating power, and that 4-person board oversees all the elections in Polk County. They essentially make the the decisions and the policy, and myself and my staff, we carry that out. So we're sort of the action arm, and ultimately our responsibility is to administer the election law of North Carolina, which is contained in this fine book. Hefty amount of laws in there. So we don't take any political stances, of course, anything like that. Our mission is to administer the law fairly and accurately for the citizens of Polk County. And so that's our mission. If you want to go ahead and look at the stats I gave you on those sheets, I do have a little bit to say about Tryon. So one thing you have to understand about our office is we don't really keep historical records. We have to destroy our records every 22 months when it comes to an election. And so we keep very limited records about what happened in the past. And so it would probably be next year before I could devote the time necessary to really look at the history of Tryon elections and dig that up.
Why do they do that?
What's that?
What's the reason that they destroy those every so many years?
Well, there's a very practical reason. If we kept those records, they would always be available for subpoena. So, for example, there were 44 counties on the eastern side of the state who just got a subpoena request from a prosecutor for every record in their office dating back to 2003, I think, which would be, it's insane. So that whole thing's in lawsuit, but essentially the idea is any record we keep is available to the public because we're a public agency, and so we don't. The law says that we, to retain the records 22 months, and that's what we do. Essentially, it's a legal reason why that would happen. Yeah.
Right.
So most of the documents that we carry some historical significance get lodged at the courthouse, which is essentially a record of who won, and that's what's preserved. But once the lawsuits are done for any given election, all that's ejected. So the first sheet that you have there, it's probably a double sheet, looks something like that. And these are the voter registration statistics, both for Tryon, the municipality, and the rest of the county. So you see at the bottom section there, we have 7 precincts, Cooper's Gap all the way through White Oak. And then you can see the amount of registered voters for each of those precincts. And then it's broken down by party and various demographic breakdowns. So one thing to notice about Tryon in terms of Polk County is it's the largest precinct. In terms of, it's got 3,100 voters. The next closest one is looking at, 2,700. So Tryon, the precinct, has more voters than any other precinct, so they have a very outsized sort of influence in county elections. And then above that, in just the Tryon municipality, you can see that there are 1,500 voters in the city limits of Tryon. And I think the most interesting thing that you can see out of that is the registration across the county is it's always a little bit skewed to the Republican side. Although unaffiliateds, if you can see, are the fastest growing group, and they're starting to outpace all the other groups. But Tryon is a little different. For some reason, it has a higher Democratic registration, and you can see by 2 to 1. So there's a very heavy concentration in the Tryon municipality. And that, I find that very interesting. It reflects national trends, I guess, because the more urbanized areas tend to have more Democratic voters, and the more rural areas more Republican, based on the stats. And so Tryon holds a unique position in Polk County in terms of its influence and its voter registration. It's actually slightly different than the rest of the county. And then I added on that second sheet, you can see the turnout stats for all 7 precincts for the presidential election in 2016. And so you can see that Tryon, the precinct, voted almost 400 voters more than any other precinct. And so Tryon has a history of good voter turnout, and they have a big influence in Polk County elections. So is there any questions about registration, the Tryon stats, or anything that you see there?
Well, I just have a question about this mystery district
Okay, certainly. Okay, so there are
that
5.
has so few voters.
Yeah, so there are 5 voters who currently, because of the addresses they give us, we really don't know where they live.
Okay,
and
so they're the mystery voters.
Yeah, so they don't have a precinct assigned, and when they show up to vote, they're gonna have to confirm their addresses and make sure we have their residence address correct before they're allowed to vote. So, it's very rare. In fact, those 5 are fairly new in our system. We just haven't worked them out yet. One of them I know for sure is Rutherford County, and so they'll be moved off of our books shortly. We have a lot of trouble with Rutherford County because on that border, everyone's mailing address says Rutherfordton. And so they're typically placed with Rutherford County by the DMV, and then we have to fix it all.
Well, better than a while back when some of the people in the southern part of the county were being delivered from South Carolina.
Yeah, and so we just finished, since I've been in Polk County, a big project where they resurveyed the South Carolina-North Carolina border. And so we've done a lot of work to clean up that southern border, and I think at this point it's very clean.
Was anything changed?
What's that?
Was anything changed?
No, they were trying to kick a few votes. The Hunting Country area, the road down there, there were a couple of those that ended up switching precinct. And we prevented a few voters from being kicked to South Carolina and kept them in North Carolina by doing some research and driving out to their properties and that kind of thing. So the technologies allow us to get much, much better with that, and it's improving every day.
I heard the word was that when they did the survey, it fell a lot closer along the lines that they did with the colonial chain surveying than the most recent modern survey.
That's interesting.
Yeah, mapping is very interesting, and it has a very big impact on our job. So borders, lines, and all that, very important to us, but as you know, they're lines, and so they're very difficult sometimes to match up. So that's part of our constant job. So really, you know, and that's the current picture of sort of Tryon and its influence in Polk County. Of course, a lot of candidates also come from Tryon as well, a good majority of them, and part of that reason is because they might have a lot of support from voters because of the numbers. Okay, so this is the choice.
What are the comparisons of populations of Tryon and Columbus and Saluda?
Okay, so Tryon is definitely the largest at 1,500, and I do not have, I think Columbus, if my recollection is correct, is somewhere around the 800s in terms of their city limits. And Saluda is lower than that, but I don't have
They're
that.
think maybe-
500,
How many?
What's that?
between 500 and 600.
That would be,
I was gonna-
600 is the number
I was gonna
gonna
guess
say.
6, but I think I've seen figures on Columbus that said 9 something.
Yeah, and that may be, so it could have climbed a little bit.
But Tryon's at least 50% larger.
Yes, and so Tryon by far has the largest city impact in the county. Columbus, you know, is really kind of small, and then Saluda tends to just be out on its own a little bit there because of the geography, essentially. It's a little more cut off.
And Mill Spring is part of it too?
So Mill Spring is not a municipality, but they are a, you know, a township that became a precinct.
What are they included in, as Mill Spring, or are they kicked in with something else?
No, so Mill Spring.
Mill Spring.
Yeah, so if you look at that, the sheet that has all 7 precincts on there, you can see the 7, so Mill Spring is White Oak. I apologize.
Okay.
Those go back and forth in my head very easily, but White Oak is essentially the Mill Spring precinct. Okay?
Is that the property, is part of the White Oak property where, the line is there between Rutherfordton and Polk County, near where the Green River Plantation is?
That's
Green
great.
River Plantation, so that's squarely in our Green Creek precinct, near the border of where it would come into White Oak. But I believe that
It's
area.
right down below White Oak Plantation,
Yeah.
Green River Plantation.
So I think
Is that part of the White Oak, or is that part of?
that's part of Green Creek.
Of Green Creek?
And I think just north of that, everything would go into the White Oak area. Yeah. And so really, our precincts follow what would be the old township line. So if you have any understanding of the townships that Polk County had, our lines are essentially the same with minor differences.
I don't want to get you off the subject, but I lived in Kentucky for a good many years and moved back to North Carolina in 2014. North Carolina used to have townships, but does it not still, you said old township?
Okay, so townships, and from my elections perspective, yes, there are townships, but nobody uses them anymore. In fact, they have no practical effect on anything that anybody does, except that our lines are based on them, and nobody maintains those lines anymore. So there's a
Except they are
constant.
on the GIS, the Polk County GIS.
Okay,
that
so
show-
yeah, but so there's a huge problem along some of the lines because the line used to run through the woods. And now there's a huge neighborhood there that runs, where the line runs right through it. So no one used to care where the line was exactly, 10 feet this way, 10 feet that way. But now there are houses there, and it makes a very big difference where that line is. And so now, you know, we're going back to maps, you know, that are ancient, and there's not enough resolution to say where that line is. It's a constant battle. So there are townships, our lines are based on them, but nobody uses township lines anymore in a practical sense, and so nobody has been maintaining the accuracy of those lines. And we maintain our precinct lines, which are very, you know, slightly different. Well, so one of the things, since I didn't have a lot on Tryon's history, I did want to talk a little bit about just the history of voting. Cheryl asked me if I'd talk a little bit about the importance of voting, and you know, one thing that concerns people these days is just the contentious nature of our politics. But something I try and point out to people is that that is not a bug in our system. It's nothing new. It's really a feature. It's sort of built into our system. And I might point out, say, the Kavanaugh hearings, no matter which side you're on, you probably felt like that was a circus, that there's a lot of acrimony, that people are fighting, just butting heads. But that's a feature of our democratic system, not necessarily a problem. It's built in a very real sense. So we can discuss things like our judges, right? Most places around the world have no say and no voice at all. And so all the discussion that we had around something like the seating of a judge doesn't even get to happen in most other places in the world. So the very fact that we can discuss those things and talk about them and fight about them is part of our system. And along those lines, just a quote from Alexander Hamilton in the Federalist Papers, he just said that, let me get my reading glasses. That liberty by necessity creates faction, and by what he meant party by that. So if we have freedom, then that feature of arguing and fighting is sort of built in. If you want to get rid of that, then you also have to eliminate the freedoms that come with that. And so it's a very delicate subject, but things get worse and they get better, but the cycle keeps going, and it's not necessarily bad, is my point. And so just to prove that point, I'm going to go through a laundry list of big changes that we've had in just just over 200 years in our country. So in 1776, when we were established, who could vote?
Landowners.
Landowners, that's correct.
Only men.
Okay, not yet. So at this point, the law says property owners. It doesn't exclude gender or anything like that, but I think in a practical sense, probably the men were the landowners, yeah. So about 10, 11 years later, the Constitution is written. There are no national standards for registration or voting. The states have all the power to decide that for themselves. 2 years later, George Washington is elected. What percentage of the population voted? Any
Very
guess?
small because of the transportation and communication limitations.
And the restrictions at that point for the property owners.
Could you repeat that, because I don't think we can.
Yeah, no, that's fine. So what percentage of the population voted for our first president? Have any idea?
10%?
6% of the people voted and when Washington was elected. So that shows you sort of where we started, right? A very limited group of people allowed to vote. 1790, a citizen is defined as free and white. Okay, so now we're starting to open it up a little bit, but in a very restrictive way. So people were allowed to be naturalized as citizens if you were white. 1848, so now we're jumping ahead almost 60 years. So almost nothing happens in that next 60 years. It's basically free white men who can vote, all the way up until 1848. Okay, so we're almost 100 years now.
Excuse me, did nothing happen while Jackson was president?
So
That was 1829.
no, so there's a whole
1827.
series of little things going on there, which I left out, but it's mostly revolving around the rights of Indians.
Okay.
American Indians were a class of people who got rights, got them taken away, got rights, got them taken away. A constant battle, whether they were a citizen or not.
Okay.
Apologize for that. That's my wife.
Not to Jackson.
So, 1848, citizenship is extended to non-whites, but voting is limited to English-speaking people only, and they use that a lot to exclude people. So all the immigrants were basically excluded by language restrictions at that point. So we're still 100 years after the birth of the country, and we're still limiting voting essentially to English-speaking free white males. 1856, voting is expanded to all white men. So now you don't have to own property, but if you're a white man, you can vote. North Carolina was actually the last state to remove the property requirement, as an interesting trivia point.
When was that?
That was 1856, okay? 1868, we get the 14th Amendment. So now citizenship is extended to former slaves. So at this point, citizenship is now open to peoples of all color. Immigrants are allowed to be naturalized as citizens. However, voters are still defined as male at this point, okay? 1870, a little bit later, 15th Amendment comes, and now you cannot deny voting privileges by race. Okay, so that has now, this is the first time, 1870, where race is being taken off the table as a disqualifying reason not to vote. However, people were still denied the right to vote through that whole time period through a combination of literacy tests, taxes, and intimidation. And if you've never seen one of the literacy tests that they offered at those times, I encourage you to look one up online. I had them available on my computer, which didn't turn on. Amazing, and I dare say that most people today would fail those literacy
So the
tests.
white males that were not questioned would probably fail these tests that were putting.
And there were things going on, for example, say you had to be able to quote sections by memory of the state constitution that you lived in. So the people who were asking you could choose any passage that they wanted to. So if you were a white person, you would get an easy little section of 2 sentences. And if you were, not white of any other persuasion, you would get some ridiculous passage that nobody in their right mind could ever recite. Legal language about
Something obscure.
insane and obscure topics. Very interesting. But people were excluded for those reasons, the literacy, the taxes, and they just intimidated them at the polls. I mean, there were constantly violent things going on at the polls to scare people away. Okay, that was 1870. 1876, indigenous people were not allowed to vote. That means the American Indians. The Supreme Court made a ruling at that point that they were not citizens allowed to vote. Okay, so that was not super long ago, really, when you think about it. But 1890 comes and things start to change here. So Wyoming becomes a state, and they're the first state that allows women to vote, yes. And so
But then
only
they have
their
to-
state, but it opened the door. Because now 30 years pass, right, before the 19th Amendment, and women can vote. But there's a ton of activity in those 30 years. A lot of women working very hard to establish the right to vote. And that was a very, that 30-year period was pretty tense as far as that goes.
Do you know how many states allowed women to vote in 1920 until the amendment?
I do not know at that
I don't
time.
either, I just have to look it up.
There were, but if, they were western states.
Mhm.
So I do know there was none of the eastern states. So all the original colonies and whatnot, they did not allow women to vote. But the newer territories, as they were coming in, were allowing them to, yes. So 19th Amendment, 1920, that's a big time, but so we're only now 100 years distant from ourselves, and women are just now getting the right to vote at 1920. 1926, so this is just what happened in Birmingham, I guess. A lot of black women voters were intimidated at the polls violently. There was a big to-do, and it was voter registration officials, so actual, officials of the state who inflicted that violence. So even at that time, okay, after the 19th Amendment has been passed, you're still seeing southern states block the vote through violence. And then 1926, we've got to go all the way to 1963, 64 before you see any more opening of the vote. So from 1920 all the way through, you know, the 60s, essentially voting remained pretty static in terms of who was allowed to vote. So in the 60s, 63, 64, voting rights gets tied into civil rights. And that whole movement started, which results in a bunch of amendments and acts to follow. So 1964, they took away by the 24th Amendment that you could not have a tax to vote. So now we've eliminated that requirement. And then the big one, okay, so 1965, the Voting Rights Act by the federal government. So up until this time, the states have essentially controlled voting and registration and all that. This is the first time that the federal government is stepping in and saying, okay, we're going to oversee all this stuff. And the Voting Rights Act, essentially, the essence of it, right, is that you can't discriminate when it comes to voting, you know, for all the typical reasons, you know, the age, gender, race, all of that stuff, no longer allowed at a federal level. Okay, so that's very important in the tone that's being set. Now states are going to get sued by the federal government, and it happens a lot in the coming time period, where the federal government is trying to get the states to comply with the Voting Rights Act. But that was the big one.
And that's the act that involves, prohibits gerrymandering.
Yes.
So then you have a lot of lawsuits as to whether the lines are being drawn.
Yeah, and so we'll get that, and that's the modern battle mostly. So we're working our way up to that. That's right. So voting age goes to 18 in 1971. Why?
Because they're going to fight wars and they want to.
The Vietnam War. All these kids are being sent off and getting killed. Well, you know, shouldn't they be allowed to vote? The country said yes. And so we opened that up.
They also briefly said they should be allowed to drink. But
Yeah. Yeah.
May I throw something in here?
Yes, sir.
I was involved in a legislative battle in 1965 in North Carolina to allow the 18-year-old vote. It failed by 1 or 2 votes in the General Assembly. A lot of the legislators told me that was irrelevant.
And the fact that they went to war?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, completely irrelevant. I remember one legislator who was a very intelligent man looked at me and said, "Well, they calculated 16, so should they be allowed to vote then?"
Right. You know.
As if they're the same.
Yeah, as if it was false equivalence, and this man knew better. Some of them might not have.
All this discussion is going to wrap itself up in some fundamental questions I'm going to ask you at the end. So 75, voting materials need to be available in other languages if you meet certain population thresholds. That's still true today. And then we get all the way, that things stay static again, all the way until 93, and we get the National Voter Registration Act. So this is trying to open up registration, you know, to as many people as possible. So now, based on that act, you can register at the DMV, public assistance agencies, and all that. So what has that resulted in? Now, today, we get almost all of our registrations through the DMV. I mean, people coming in our office now, we get a few, but most of our registration is actually done by those agencies, especially the DMV, because everybody goes there. So that expands the access to registration in a major, major way, and we still are, you know, bound by those laws in a very strict way. So 93, that act changed a lot of things in election realm, and then we get to 2001, and there's a big debate over whether felons can vote, and when, you know, if they're not allowed to vote, when can they vote again? When they finish their terms and all that. So that debate is still going on today. You're going to see there's a lot of discussion about, you know, who can vote when and why. But on the heels of that is the Help America Vote Act, the HAVA Act, 2002. So why did we pass the HAVA Act, 2002?
What's the?
Florida.
It's
Florida hanging
Yeah.
chads. You all remember, right? The
Yeah,
hanging
yeah.
chads. So the HAVA Act was instituted by the federal government that forced all counties and states to have provisional voting for fail-safe voting reasons. Expanded access to the polls for disabilities in the ADA, the whole American Disabilities Act. It centralized our voting registration lists at the state level, so now that there's one record of everybody who is registered to vote. Up until that time, those records might have been kept all over the state in individuals' people's houses and things like that. So this sort of standardizes everything. And this is all happening in 2002, right? Not long ago. It instituted the electronic machines instead of the mechanical machines. So now almost, even if we're using paper ballots, it's still going to be read by an optical scanner as opposed to some kind of mechanical machine. So everything moved to sort of electronics. And then it also forced everybody to show ID to register. So we don't need ID to vote, but we do need ID to register at this time because of the HAVA Act. And that really brings us up to today and the things that we're talking about. So what are some of the things that you hear about election, this discussion about who can vote and who can't vote? It's a changing thing. It changes over time. So who is we the people?
American citizens
Sure.
have to be a citizen, don't they?
Mm-hmm.
In order to vote.
But what came up about North Carolina and the 30-day residency? And that was sort of an issue in the news.
Okay, so it's fairly common between all the states, so I think it's fairly standard, but wherever you live 30 days before the election day, that's where you're supposed to vote. So if you move, a week before election day, you're really supposed to vote back at your old location. And that's really what that's about. We don't tend to get a lot of controversy over that.
Are you automatically taken off of the record when you move from one precinct to the other?
Okay, so if you move
Only when
within
you go to
North,
the DMV.
if you move within
Yeah.
North Carolina, it's all fairly automatic because we're all connected, we talk to each other. If you show up in their system, it flags you as a duplicate and all of that. If you move to another state, it depends. So if you would register in North Carolina and you give us the info about where you used to live, we'll contact them and get you off the books. But if you don't, or you don't provide accurate info, then the other state will never know. Now we have started on the other end cross-checking who voted with other states. So I think there's 27 states now in the cross-check database, and so we're starting to integrate all of that.
When you move to another state, you have to get a driver's license for that state. And then when you go register, when you get your driver's license, you're automatically registered, because I just did that.
Right, and so it's not automatic. They'll
And-
ask you, so you have the
Oh.
option to decline. And people don't always change their licenses. Especially if you're moving, say, from South Carolina to North Carolina because they don't have car taxes in South Carolina or something like that, I don't know. But there's a reason why many people keep their South Carolina licenses, for example. But mostly that's all automatic now. And of course, databases we can check and cross-check, which we do a lot.
And also, we see tremendous gerrymandering, and there are two state legislature races coming up and one for a federal post. Does that is that difficult to manage?
It depends. When the courts get involved, it becomes very difficult to manage. So we are going to be running this next election on unconstitutional, what's been deemed unconstitutional lines. They're letting us run it on these lines because there was no other, there's no way that we could get everything changed over in time from a practical sense on the ground.
So is Polk County divided in
No.
some strange way?
No, so Polk County actually is a monolithic block. In other words, we have no splits. So, for example, what that means in our county, this election, everybody has one ballot. There's only one ballot for Polk County and everybody gets it. Henderson County, for example, has two because they have a state house split. And then, of course, like a Mecklenburg has all sorts of splits and stuff.
And Nashville is pretty contentious.
But
too.
Polk County, okay, so Polk County is a roughly 75th in population out of the 100 counties. So in a statewide sense, Polk County has very little influence, just to be honest. Even in our own congressional district, the number of votes we put out there doesn't compare to the counties that we're blocked in with.
It's the smallest county in the congressional district.
In the congressional district, it is. And so in a statewide sense, Polk County does not have a lot of influence in that sense. And so you very rarely see those candidates, congressional candidates, coming from our county, right? Because they want to choose people who are from the big places. And so that can make a difference. And so when we're redistricted, we could end up flipping to a different district. They could split us, but Polk, because of our size, is generally always going to be kept as a block and be just lumped in with somebody else. But that's great from our office's standpoint. That's right. So there's a couple things that I just sort of want to get out there with you right now. So what you have to understand, that there really is no we the people apart from the laws that create it. In other words, we the people are defined by the laws that say who those people are. And that's the way it is. That's why elections are so important, because whoever wins gets to write the laws that determine who we the people are. And who we the people are has changed, in the course of our 200 and so odd years. I guess almost 250 now. That definition has changed. And I think that we would all agree it's for the better. But is it? I would say, it's a little disheartening from an elections director standpoint when many, many people walk into your office, pick up a sample ballot, look and say, man, I didn't know all this was on here. I don't even know who these people are. And then they go proceed to vote.
Yeah.
Is that what we want as a country? Maybe, maybe not. So there are interesting questions. And so I'll ask you this, is voting a right, a privilege, or a duty?
All three.
It can be viewed as all of those things. And how you view that can really make a difference on how you want to define we the people. It can make a difference on how, open or closed the access is. We're fighting large battles now about, voter. You're going to have the opportunity this year to vote on photo ID. Is it required to show a photo ID when you come and vote? So that's going to be a change to the North Carolina State Constitution that the voters are going to be able to determine. So how do you decide whether that's a good idea or not? On one hand, you have security, and on the other hand, you have openness, both of which are very important, but they don't coexist super well together. So where do we meet in the middle? Where's the line? And we're fighting those battles all the time today in the political realm.
You're talking about North Carolina with photo ID.
Mm-hmm. That's
right.
correct. Yeah, so it's interesting to me because we had photo ID and we were crucified in the national news over that, right? I mean, we were always in the news, but there are so many other states that require. I was just looking at Florida's rules 2 days ago and they require a photo ID to vote, but I never hear that. And so it's very interesting, the battlegrounds, what people fight over and why. But in North Carolina, that security versus openness is a battle that's going on, and the voters are going to be able to decide that this election. Yes, ma'am?
Does North Carolina have voter initiatives that are brought by the voters?
Okay, so no, North Carolina is one of the least accessible states when it comes to ballot access. There's very little that a citizen can do to put anything on a North Carolina ballot. contrary to, say, California, where they can put almost anything on the ballot from a citizen's perspective. So North Carolina is very, the General Assembly has all the power in North Carolina. So your cities, your counties, all of that, they are only existing and have any power at the pleasure of the General Assembly and the laws that they make. That's where all the power in North Carolina is concentrated, and they have not opened that up to much citizen involvement.
Has there been an effort?
Not that I'm aware of. So that effort would have to come from the legislative side of things.
And start with the citizens.
So, and remember, remember, so your power is to vote and elect. But the people who make the rules are generally going to try and make the rules to benefit themselves. No matter who they are, what group they are. I mean, just in general, a human thing. So there's a lot of tension there. And winning elections is actually important. And that's why you're here. But why aren't there more?
I have a question, Chris.
Yes, ma'am.
Uh-oh, I did that again.
It's
I
okay.
answer to Chris all the time.
Oops. Okay, so I was taking a cruise, and I had my photo ID. I never wear braids. I just happened to have braids that day. I was gonna be the only one who could not board the ship. Someone else had to prove that I am who I am.
Mhm.
So you're gonna have that problem if you show ID, if you have to show ID. Because my sister, for instance, we don't know who she is from day to day.
Okay, so
You
I
show
can
your
talk-
ID at the airport.
I can talk about photo
Driver's
ID.
license.
Yeah, so, you know, I don't know where I really stand in terms of photo ID from an election administrative standpoint. Here's what I can tell you my experience is with the one election where we did require photo ID. We saw almost no practical difference. We didn't see a difference in turnout. We didn't see a difference in who showed up. We didn't see a difference in lines. There was no difference. If there was any impact, it would be on our elderly population who are in the nursing homes, okay? So what we found was they typically, you know, they don't have a driver's license, they don't have an ID because why? They may not have any, they can't get out to go get one, they may not have family to help them out. So they were the people who were probably most impacted. And so our office, you know, we did a lot of outreach trying to reach those people and make sure that was the only impact I saw.
Well, wasn't
So-
there an exclusion that they could bring a not current driver's license? One that had expired, if it hadn't expired too long?
Yes, and now that they bring that up, they did that exception at the very last second, and it was only if you were 70, it was an age-driven thing, so if you were over a certain age, then you could use an expired license. What we found was they just didn't have a license.
They weren't going
So
to
very,
get
very
somebody
few
else.
people.
My dad had an
Because I
expired
don't
license,
Yeah.
but I'd gotten him an ID card as well, but.
Yeah, so I mean, most people I think got rid of their cards
I don't look
because.
like my photo ID that I've got.
And so
now.
that's Sherelle's point is, you know, so we are not handwriting experts or photo identification experts. Generally speaking, if it looked remotely like you. I mean, we were trained, the state gave us extensive training on, you know, we could only challenge, in fact, it's a challenge-driven process, right? So if there was a challenge, there was this whole process that had to come. But the challenges couldn't be over so many things. You couldn't use age, you couldn't use race, you couldn't use anything practical to challenge it. And so in the end, you know, did my poll workers really look at those photo IDs well? I'm not sure.
Well, I wanna make one, this is not about whether you should or shouldn't. Like, I know people who have vitiligo, and so they're no longer
Bigger
my
part.
complexion anymore. They're like her complexion.
Yeah.
So that can cause a problem.
Yeah.
But I'm not saying whether you should or should not ask for photo ID.
My mother in the nursing home had a little badge on her gown all the time that had her picture on it, her name and her picture.
But see, that would not have been
Probably
a valid form of ID according to the laws that were in at the time.
Even though it was a photo and she was 91, you know, or something, she wasn't.
It had to be driver's license,
Ah.
or DMV issued ID, passport, military ID, and there was one other thing, one obscure thing, but that's it, tribal ID. That was it. So no other IDs were acceptable.
Are you close to finishing, because we don't want to hold you to.
No, so I'm actually sort of in the question and answer period, so whatever you want to talk about.
Yes.
One more, yeah.
The scanner, I was told that it would scan either side, so you didn't have to put it in upside or downside.
The ballots?
Yeah.
The paper ballots?
Uh-huh.
Okay, so just so I'm clear on this election, we will be using the touchscreen machines. This will be the last big election that we use them. We did do a paper ballot test for the systems that are coming. And yes, so the optical scanners will take the ballots in any configuration. So upside down, backwards, turned around, it scans it and takes it in any way.
What are you going to?
Paper. So we're,
Back to paper?
so in 2020,
Calling the dog or what?
we're required by state law to select a system that has a paper record, not like the ones our machine has. It has to be an actual sort of ballot.
Wonderful.
So is it gonna be,
counted.
one year we had to use special pencils. You know,
Yeah, no,
it
so
was
these, we'll be providing, but basically black ink will be sufficient. Blue ink, it reads. The machines are really, the new generation of optical scanners are phenomenal. And so I think we'll be well served. But most of our voters, they like the touch screens. Just that in North Carolina, we don't have, the new generation have not been certified and don't look like they will be anytime soon enough for us to buy them.
Historically, would you know the general percentage of turnout in midterms?
Sure, it's 50%.
Really?
Yeah,
That's
50.
not too bad.
For above registered voters, so
Yeah,
that's, you
yeah,
know.
well.
So, okay, so in
fair.
stats, generally speaking, 75% of any county is registered. Okay, and then of that 75%, 50% turnout for a midterm election would be normal. We may see a little uptick because we have some local contests that are very interesting. We have a commissioner's race, and we have the sheriff's race, which are very interesting for local people.
What about a presidential election year?
70 would be the general number. I think last time we were at 71, almost pushing 72.
That voted, 71%.
72%, yeah, of our registered voters will turn out in a presidential. So.
What kind of protections do you have against tampering with the machines?
Sure. Okay, so the machine, the current model that we use, nobody could walk up to that machine and manipulate it in any way. The first thing is you have to have the special cartridge key to do anything to that. So we keep those. They're specially programmed per machine. You couldn't even bring one from the outside. The machines are complicated enough that nobody can handle them. They don't take any normal things that people use, like flash drives or anything like that. There's just no way to get into that machine physically from your standpoint without about 3 different things that we have that we use to kind of open those machines. The second thing is that none of our machines, voting machines or the tallying systems, are connected to any networks in any way, and they never have been. So our entire voting systems are not connected to the internet. And so we don't run that risk of any kind of cyber interference. So from a physical standpoint, I could probably leave the machine out here overnight and come back the next day and be confident you couldn't have done anything to it, especially without me being able to understand what you did, just based on the nature of the machine and the proprietary cartridges and things that we use.
And what about the presidential elections? That's a little different, right?
No,
Because
it's the same.
so how do you report the results on?
Okay.
Like it used to go to News Election Services and it's called something else now, but there's a general system that reports to everybody, that's the
Okay,
news
so yeah,
agencies
if you're,
have.
if you're interested, the way that chain of votes works, so the chain of custody from the precinct to our office is super important, and we spend a lot of effort on that. And I'll just say that when we go to paper ballots, that's where the security issue, I think paper ballots are a lot less secure, because all you gotta do is get that stack of ballots and switch them out, and then what, you know, we don't know. So physical security of paper ballots is paramount, in a way that our machines, I could, like I said, I could leave it out. I cannot leave a stack of ballots out. So physical security from our standpoint is super important. You were asking the presidential election, oh, the tally. So, okay, the machines are tallied at the local precincts with the local judges. So they get a tape of the results, and then they sign that tape, all three of them. Then those judges, they all sit down at a table and they write those numbers down. They transfer the numbers from the tape to a piece of paper, and then they sign all that. Then they send the tape and the results on to us so we can read them in. But there's a record of what they wrote down at that time. Okay, so then when we get that stuff back at the office, as the precincts bring that in, we have a central computer that we tabulate all that on. That computer has also never been connected to the internet and has no capability of even doing that. So it's a standalone unit. So all those numbers come in and they're aggregated. And at each step, of course, we're confirming that those numbers matched. And so then when it's all said and done, we take that and we send it to the state via internet. We go to a different system, and then we send those numbers to the state. Once they show up on the public site, we take those numbers and run them all the way back down and break them down and make sure that none of those numbers changed along the way. So we have, each individual county is responsible for vetting, auditing their own numbers as they go. And if it comes down to it, how do we know that someone didn't change the cartridge or the tape? Because we have that signed paper that all three judges wrote those numbers down. So if there was a mismatch, we would know we had a problem. Numbers reporting is actually fairly simple for us because our systems are so geared to locking that down and making sure that the numbers don't change in any way, and they never really have. We just finished, for example, a mock election is what we call, where we vote on the machines. Say, this time we voted about 738 ballots on our machines, and then we close them, get the numbers, run them through the whole system, and make sure everything's working. Something that's done every election, and the machines are usually flawless. If there's an error, it's usually been a human error that, they transcribe a number, easily caught. Systems are very tight in terms of that. The paper ballots, when they come, that's going to be a very different logistic issue for us in terms of keeping them physically secure.
But that's a backup, right? The idea for the paper is a backup in case everything
Yeah, and
else
so,
fails.
ultimately people like to have that, they like to know that we have a paper ballot with the marks on there. But our current machines, I don't know if you paid attention, but they have a roll, so everything, every mark that you're making on the machine is being recorded on that you can see. And so as long as you as the voter look and see, hey, the name that I just selected showed up on that piece of paper, you can be guaranteed your vote will count. Because after the election, like 30 days, when everything's said and done, we go back and we read those tapes one by one and we hand count them and match them back just to make sure that in the end, the paper ballot matched. And the state gives us some random samples that we have to do that too. It's a big formal process that's open to the public, so anyone's always allowed to come and see us do that, as well as election night. So all of our processes are open. When we count, when we tabulate, when the board's making decisions, those are public meetings that anyone is allowed to be at. We very, very rarely get people other than like lawyers, because it's boring. But if you're fairly interested, it can be interesting if you're into that kind of thing, but the actual process is boring.
Who were the user-friendly people that are sitting at the polls checking people in?
Okay, that's a good question. So at every precinct, there are 3 judges, okay? They're sort of an official appointed position where they have specific statutory duties. Those judges are nominated by the local parties, and so the 2 of them are going to be the party of whatever the governor is. So that's currently Democrat, and then 1 is of the opposite party. So you've got those 3 people at every precinct. Beyond that, you have assistants, which are just people that we hire.
Is that nationwide or just North Carolina?
That's just North Carolina. So that entire process is driven. Our judges are essentially given to us by the local parties. And then the assistants, we basically choose for competence. Because we don't, the sad truth is that when we don't choose the judges, we don't really know what we're getting. They may not be, plenty of our older judges are not computer savvy and can't run the laptops, for example. So this election, for example, I've got a lot of student workers coming from the local school systems. They help us. There's a special program for 17-year-olds. And they always do a phenomenal job. They're really fast. And we try and emphasize customer service, so I hope that they are friendly faces and being nice at the polls. I think Polk County's crews have been very well comported, and so.
I want to ask a question that goes beyond the bounds of your job, really, but you may have some insight. And I guess it's, in a way, a philosophical question. I'd like to know how much education is devoted in schools today. I don't think we teach civics anymore. How much do high school students know about the history of what's happened in North Carolina? Let me tell you what I'm after. The Senate seat that was held by Sam Ervin, he retired in 1975, and what year did Tillis come in? 2015, 2013, I think it's the same seat. So we're talking 40 years. How many times did that seat turn over in 40 years? It must have been 6 or 7 times. People say I don't have any power at the vote. My vote won't matter. Incumbents always stay in regardless. That's not true. And I think if the election, I wonder what students think about this today, because a lot of adults don't understand it. I think if that 2000 presidential election proved anything, it was that your vote counted. A lot of people didn't see it that way at all. When you get right down to it, 37 votes decided the presidency. How much closer could anything be? If 38 people stayed home that day, a different man would have been president. Are those lessons lost on people today? Do you have any idea?
We started a discussion earlier at the beginning that touches on this. My general feeling is that ignorance of the election system, and ignorance in a good sense, just meaning that they don't know, right? The ignorance of the election system is rampant at any age. But the young people in particular it's not important to them.
We were
So
talking
you
about
look at the age stats of our voters, especially in Western North Carolina, and it's 60% or more of our voters are age 65 or older.
60%.
It's if you look at the graphs, it's this and then the big jump over here at the older population. And people don't really start voting in numbers until they hit their 30s.
I was thinking when you were talking about older people, you were talking about your mother's ID and how that wouldn't have counted. So there's a certain irony in that. The older people are the ones who really would like to vote in most cases. Will vote if it's at all possible to get out.
Yes.
It's almost a religion. But younger people, I know there's nothing probably any of us in the room can do about this, but I think most of us, when we were in school, were taught civics. We're taught about these things. And I think it's been taken out of the curriculum today. Understanding may never have been as good as it should have been, but I think we understood it better as young people than it's understood today because we were taught it.
There are groups out there, including things like MTV, the music television channel and stuff, that have consistently attempted to turn out the young votes. In fact, you'll hear that this election, I'm sure. I heard something on NPR on the way to work this morning about turning out young people. And I just kind of chuckled because it's an ongoing effort that everybody is trying, because you know, they hope that they can get them to vote on their way, and they just don't turn out. So this election is very interesting to me because, you know, they're saying, because of a lot of celebrities and things like that, that the younger people will be more engaged, that the registration's gonna be higher and all of that, but will that happen?
We'll see.
I hope so.
In Florida would be the spot because the students were so outraged at the shooting. And, you know.
True.
So those are the things that people are saying are gonna drive turnout.
But
I've heard it in the past. I would love to see the young people turn out, but I'm not seeing it in my office yet.
It's just a source of constant frustration to me because there's self-fulfilling prophecies involved here. People say my vote won't count, so it doesn't.
Right.
And I don't know,
On the other hand, my feeling about that ultimately is if they don't vote, my vote counts for more.
well, you could argue that certainly.
Yeah.
Unless they're voting your way.
And I'd like my vote to, you know, except if I vote for you, you're probably gonna lose. That's the way it works. We're getting those kids
Yeah, I know
registered
that.
at the DMV when they go turn 16 and get their
Right,
licenses.
right.
And they hang out in our system, and when they turn 18, we send them all the stuff so they can, you know, be properly registered. And I think the law's gonna change now where they will automatically be registered.
Okay.
Um,
But people talk about empowerment, yet they won't exercise the power.
Funny story that happened to me when I
Okay.
first moved to Polk County. It was a presidential election and my mother was up visiting me. When I first moved here, I went to the Board of Elections and I signed all the proper to register to vote. My daughter, who has the same name as me, goes in and she signs all the papers for her to be able to vote. Well, I was gonna go by and vote, and then I was taking my mother all the way down to Forsyth County to vote because it was very important to her to do that. I wait in line with all the old people, and I get up and I say I'm Linda Lee Reynolds, and they look at me and said, "Well, you've already voted."
That was your daughter.
And I said, "And how old was she?" And they said, yeah. I'm Linda Lee Reynolds, and they had taken me off the book. Oh, well, we went through the records and we saw 2 Linda Lee Reynolds, so we just took one off. I had to go all this whole,
Oh my gosh.
out back over to the
Board of Elections.
Board of Elections, raise Cain.
Sure. Okay,
It really was awful,
and so.
but I did get the vote.
That is not the most rare circumstance ever. Poll workers can often, your situation is slightly different, but even with like fathers and sons who have the same name, a lot of times the poll worker will pull the wrong one. Nobody will notice, they'll sign the form, the voter will sign the form and just go on.
Oh, yeah.
And then the father shows up and they're like, you already voted. So we have methods now to handle all that and make sure that happens, that the voter can vote. But at this point, we would never remove a duplicate without matching social security number and date of birth.
Oh, no,
So that wouldn't happen anymore.
They didn't match anything.
No.
They just
You would not believe how many people have the same name and birthdays. It's shocking. I mean,
And
you would not
birthday?
believe it.
Yeah.
And birthday. I'm telling you, you get enough people together and you will have that happen. And it's very, you know, we're very alert for it because it's not rare. Same birthday and name. Oh yeah. There's at least 3 I can think of in our county that, I mean, I don't know their names, but I know that we've had the situation.
You know when North Carolina first used voting machines?
We began to, you mean electronic machines?
Yeah, or
2006.
mechanical.
Okay, so we've been using those big voting machines for a long time, but I know the first electronic versions came in 2006.
You know, some years ago, I was talking to some old men, this has been 40 plus years ago, closer to 50. I won't name the county, but it wasn't even the western part of the state. And one thing led to another, and some of these old guys started bragging about how they had swiped ballots marked for Tom Dewey in 1948.
So paper ballots, It's a whole different realm. And in fact, I can think of a lot of stories in Madison County and
Oh,
one
yeah.
in Henderson County where people broke into the offices to try and manipulate ballots or steal ballots and do all that. So physical, paper ballots, it all comes down to a chain of custody and a very rigid physical security.
If I remember correctly, some of these men were working at the polls. I may have that wrong. But somebody said something about Truman being elected, and one of the old guys started chuckling and said, well, we kind of helped out with that.
So just as an aside, there was, say, a case in Durham County in 2016 where an actual election worker lost some ballots and just ran some through twice to make up the numbers. About 200 ballots. And so he's now in jail.
I'll tell you that very
So nowadays, that stuff is, you can't get away with that and not end up in jail at this point because our tracking systems are too good. I mean, we track down, this last election out of, roughly 12,000 votes, we had one problem in terms of not being able to, we don't know exactly what happened on this one situation because a poll worker made an egregious mistake. But it's very difficult to get away with those kinds of things these days.
I lived a very quick one. I lived in Louisville, Kentucky for years, and there was a certain man there who was somewhat notorious. He was a big property owner, and kind of slid by on a lot of things, like paying taxes. And I was coming out of the polls one day, and he was going in. I said, well, Jesse, you don't live here. You don't live in this precinct. I know. He said, I know. I vote in 2 places. And just walked right on in. He's the kind of guy that didn't mind telling that.
Yeah, and when everything was paper-based, that would be a lot easier to get away with.
Mm-hmm.
These days, you get in a lot of trouble.
I'm sure he would.
So I always enjoy the opportunity, even if it's a small group, because you can go tell others.
Right.
You can now, when other people have questions, you'll know the answer. And so it's never unfruitful for me to do something like this. I always enjoy
We
it.
appreciate it.
business card.
We prefer that people call and ask us the questions before just showing, if you don't know where to vote, call us. Don't just go, because then you'll be mad when you're at the wrong place. We'll let you know where to go.
Well, she said she's gonna post this on YouTube, so.
Oh, that's great.
I haven't talked about that.
Do you have a message that you want to say to the YouTube viewers?
Only that the Polk County Board of Elections is committed to fair, accurate, and honest elections, and that's what we're going to do, so we hope you come out and vote.